What's good, fam? Teacher Eddie back with another oversimplified reaction. The American Revolution Part 1. Let's get into it.
Columbus, time of his life, hammock. And suddenly the race was on to explore and conquer the New World. After a couple centuries of warring with the natives and each other, the European powers had claimed quite a lot of land, including this area, which both the English and the French claimed as theirs. One day the French said, "I'm gonna build some forts along here," and the English were like, "Could you not?" And the French said, "Sorry, but no, I could not." And they went ahead and built their forts, which pissed off the English, so they sent an up-and-coming British lieutenant colonel by the name of George Washington with a combined force of British troops and Native Americans. After a short battle, the French commander said, all right, we surrender." "Okay, boys, pack it up. There's surrender." Oh, sorry, was I not meant to split his head open with...
Oh, God, yeah. So this is the beginnings of the battle of the mites, the European mites, the French and the English. Who was going to be the superior power? So, spoiler alert, the British do win. This is where George Washington makes his name. So a lot of people, of course, know that George Washington was the father of our country, the first president, unanimously elected, the general of all generals who led the army in the American Revolution. But George Washington was also one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, of the founding fathers. And it's during this time that he really makes a name for himself, because he's given this high position at a very pretty young age, right? And so the French and the English are fighting over territory and also kind of supremacy as to, who was the big power, right, at the time in Europe. So the English do eventually win what is known as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. And this, of course, is the prelude that leads to the eventual revolution.
With the tomahawk? Don't worry. It's not like this will start a 7-year-long major global conflict. And what happened next was a 7-year-long major global conflict, which Great Britain won. At the peace negotiations, Spain gave up Florida, while France gave up all of its territories in North America. But Britain's victory came at a cost, a £60 million cost. They were now broke, in a lot of debt, and had to come up with some way to repay it. So they went to the colonies and said, okay, listen up. So a huge part of the war was spent protecting you from the French, and now we have no money because of it. So... I'm not sure what you're saying here. Okay, so we spent a lot of money protecting you from the French, right? Right. And now we're broke.
And by the way, don't mind my roommate back there. He's constantly bitching about me being too loud. But yeah, so England does come out as the victor during the conflict, and they go broke, right? They spend a lot of money. And again, the way we're taught, and by we, I mean Americans, as far as the war for independence, or as the English would call it, insurrection, the war of insurrection, the Americans really, you could say, we're being kind of ingrates, right? Because there's different ways depending on how you view the subject. And I've talked about it previously in other videos, but the English really weren't asking for anything outrageous, right? We're taught, that, the Americans, they were patriots, and these big, bad, terrible English people who were holding them, under the foot of their rule. But really, you could kind of view America as, a relationship between a teenager and their parent. Like, hey, I pay the bills around here. I've been, paying your way since you were born, buying you all those toys you wanted. We got this nice house. You got your own room. You got your Xboxes and PlayStations. But money's a little tight. Maybe you can get like a part-time job and kind of, kick in. And the kid's like, wait, are you, what are you saying? Are you actually speaking English here? Because I'm not kind of getting what you want me to do here. You want me to give up all this cool stuff that I have and my precious time? I got shit to do, Dad. Yeah, but all I'm asking you for is just kicking. No, I'm good, man. All right, well, you know what? I'm going to have to take away your allowance. Take away my allowance, god damn it. That's it. I'm suing for independence.
That certainly is a pickle. Listen to me. We spent all of our money protecting
Sounds like a you
and
problem.
now we need money. Can you please pay us back some money? No. Okay,
Nope.
we're just going to go ahead and tax you. In 1764, Britain introduced the Sugar Act, forcing the colonists to import sugar and molasses exclusively from the British and to pay duties on them. Then a year later, they introduced the extremely controversial Stamp Act, and it worked a little something like this. Hello, shopkeep. Hello, Mr. Bungleberry. Here's the deed for your new shack. Stamp. That'll be 3 pence, please. Wait, what was that? It's the new tax. I get a stamp on any paper or documentation I make, and you have to pay for it. Would you like to see this pamphlet that explains everything? Yes, please. Okay. Stamp. 2 pence, please. This is awful. You know what? Just give me a deck of cards so I can go gamble my pain away. Okay.
Stamp it. Stamp it.
Don't do
Stamp it.
Stamp. Obviously, the colonists were like, hey, my dudes, this new tax legislation right here, this is BS. Until now, they had enjoyed relative freedom to rule themselves, and now suddenly...
Yeah, that really was the case. So originally, the colonies that were set up because the English wanted to populate the areas because there's an ocean separating England and its colonies in America. So what England decided to do was to populate it with indentured servants. So a lot of them were people who had been in debtor's prison, right? So, for example, Benjamin Franklin's father, he was in major debt and he was offered, kind of like they offer, for minor offenses. They used to offer back in the day. I don't know if they still do it, but hey, you can either go to jail or you can go and join the army, right? And so they did this a lot, especially during Vietnam. So it was, hey, go to debtor's prison, or you can go to these colonies and look out for our interests under our supervision. And of course, most people were like, yeah, I'll go to the colonies, fine. But the problem was for the English was, well, how are you going to keep an eye out for them? So they were really allowed to do pretty much whatever they wanted. And that kind of goes into this whole spoiled aspect of the colonists, that when they're asked to pay a simple tax, it wasn't really the tax they had an issue with, as much as the fact that they had no voice in their government, right? So that's where you get taxation without representation. It's like, hey man, if you're going to tax us, we should at least have a voice in the same government that is creating all of these taxes. So we want to be represented in the parliament. And the English were like, nah, we're good, right? Don't forget who you work for, okay? Don't forget who pays the bills. Don't forget who set up all this land. Don't forget who just fought a war to protect this land that you call home. All we're asking you is to kind of kick in your fair share. We're not asking for anything outrageous here, but not everyone. That's another huge misconception, is that, everybody just got together and was like, man, that's it. We want to be independent. Even at this point, independence was on really very few people's minds. Basically, up until the Declaration is actually written, people like George Washington, people like Hamilton, people like Adams, they want to have a peaceful end to this. They want to be recognized as true Englishmen. And that really, beyond representation, beyond the taxation, beyond anything else, they did not feel like they were true Englishmen. And that's really what they wanted to be. They wanted to be recognized as Englishmen. And they did not feel, if they didn't have representation or the respect of the English government, that they were Englishmen. And that's what they truly wanted. George Washington would have settled at any point up until the war started if they were truly recognized as part of the English government, kingdom, everything, right? That's really what they were looking for.
Suddenly, Britain was asserting its control. They were especially unhappy because they didn't have any representatives in the parliament that was levying taxes on them.
Yeah.
So they protested. Orators
Exactly.
gave fiery speeches. British goods were boycotted, and anyone loyal to the British found themselves increasingly harassed. The whole thing actually began to take quite a toll on British business, and after just a couple years, the British were forced to repeal the Stamp Act. But we still desperately need money. What should we do? We could try taxing the colonies. Great idea. Wait, didn't we literally just try that and it failed miserably? Man, look at me. I look fabulous. Have you ever seen such a handsome boy? No siree, Georgie. No way. You're the handsomest, smartest, most popular king that ever lived, and everybody likes you. You're doing such a good job. Your Majesty? Oh, you're still here. Get the hell out. So in 1766, the British made a declaration saying, we can do what we want because we're in charge and you can all go suck it. Then they levied a whole bunch of new taxes on the Americans via import duties. Glass? There's a tax for that. Lead? There's a tax for that. Paper? Tea? Oil? There's a tax.
Yeah, look at that oil. Look at that Earl. But yeah, it's basically like Bill Wirtz, right? You can make a religion out of that. They're like, what is this? A brush? Hey, you can tax that. And that's basically what they did, even after the Stamp Act miserably failed and the British rescinded it. Their idea was, well, let's just come back with taxes on everything. Sugar, paper, oil, everything that you need, we're going to tax it. And the funny thing is, we fight for independence, and then we set up a government that basically taxes everything. We get taxes on taxes. We get taxes even after we die. We have to pay taxes on money that was already taxed. The estate tax, people.
Tax for that. And once again, the Americans boycotted British goods, British business felt the pinch, and the British had to back down. Alright, this is ridiculous. They're my colonies, and I have to be able to assert my control. Repeal all the new taxes except for the one on tea. Also send 1,000 troops to Boston to take control. Oh, and make the colonists pay for them. And as British troops arrived, the tension in Boston was palpable. You could cut it with a knife, and it was all about to come to a head. On March 5th, a band of local patriots began heckling a British guard at the customs house. More and more Americans joined in the heckling, while more British troops turned up in support of their comrade. Snowballs were thrown at the British. The snowballs turned to rocks, the rocks to oyster shells. The soldiers, outnumbered, panicked. One thing leads to another, and you can see where this is going.
Buck.
5 civilians were killed. The Patriot press throughout the colonies declared the Boston Massacre an unwarranted crime committed against the people of Boston by the cruel British, and the anger continued to grow. A British revenue schooner that ran aground in Rhode Island.
Yeah, so the Boston Massacre. So again, propaganda was huge during this time period, and also for the eventual revolution itself. For example, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which became, I mean, off the charts. We're talking about Harry Potter type sales, right? So propaganda was huge in convincing the common person in the colonies that independence was a good idea. Because again, a lot of people at this point are still just not even close to wanting independence or anything else. So the Boston Massacre was really blown out of proportion. Yes, 5 people were killed, but in reality, the people that were basically heckling and mobbing the British soldiers, I mean, they made it seem like, oh, they were just throwing snowballs. But no, just like they said in the video, they were throwing rocks, they were throwing clamshells. So it wasn't a peaceful protest at all. It was an unruly mob. Did the British officers overreact? Possibly, yes. But they were trying to defend themselves because there were only a few of them against a whole mob that was turning extremely violent. And the interesting thing here is, eventually all of the British soldiers were acquitted and were actually defended by none other than John Adams himself. If you ever watched the HBO miniseries John Adams, I think there's a whole episode dedicated to it. And John Adams was really not popular with his colleagues after that, because he basically defended the enemy, and not only defended the enemy, but got them acquitted from these charges. So the evidence did prove that, hey, they had every right to defend themselves.
Island was burned by the locals. When it came to light that the governor of Massachusetts supported the suppression of the colonists, his house was burned by the locals. And next, the colonists would set their sights on the remaining tax on tea. On December 16th, 1773, a band of patriots known as the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans, marched down to Boston Harbor, boarded a British merchant ship loaded with tea, and in front of thousands of spectators, threw nearly 10,000 pounds worth of tea overboard.
Yeah, the Sons of Liberty, again, they disguise themselves, of course, as Native Americans, which in and of itself is, but you had a lot of these groups like the Sons of Liberty, then you had the Sons of Freedom, and these groups were really, if you were England, you would view them as terrorists, really. They were committing acts of treason. And that's the way the British viewed them as, again, treasonous terrorists, which is not much different from modern day groups that call themselves the Sons of anything, whether it's the Sons of Liberty or Proud Boys or whatever it may be. But yes, this was a major, major attack, and probably one of the most famous ones that we learn in school.
The British were disgusted, and they punished Massachusetts with a vengeance. They dissolved its General Assembly, revoked their charter, and sent 3,000 more troops to occupy the city, meaning Boston and Massachusetts were now essentially under the direct rule of Great Britain. And oh boy, were the people...
Yeah, so that was another point, because England had allowed all of the colonies to basically rule themselves with very, very little interference from England itself. So that was another reason why England was kind of like, the hell, man? Like, we basically just let you have free reign, do whatever the hell you want, and you don't want to kick nothing into the pot, you know? It's like Mr. Pink in Reservoir Dogs when he doesn't want to tip. And old man is like, what are you talking about? You don't tip. I paid the goddamn bill. I don't give a damn if you don't tip. Kick in your buck.
People pissed. The other colonies saw what was happening and worried they might be next. So they called a brain trust to decide what to do. 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered and met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress, and the roll call read like a who's who of America's finest thinkers. I'm talking lawyers extraordinaire Johnny A. and Johnny J, experienced military commander George Washington, businessman and future alcoholic beverage Samuel Adams, fiery orator Patty H., guy who married a rich lady, Big J. Dickinson. And while they weren't present at the first Congress, soon names like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and much later Alexander Hamilton would all serve time in the Continental Congress. Yep. The question now, though, was what to do about the British. After much bitter debate and disagreement, they eventually agreed on...
Now, notice one thing. George Washington is in his uniform. So this actually happened. Every single meeting that Washington showed up at, he wanted to make sure that everybody knew that he was a military man. So if it did come to the fact that there would be a war, guess who they would choose? Now, of course, at this point, again, Washington is an extremely respected man. Washington is, again, one of the wealthiest landowners in the colonies. It's his land that eventually the White House would be built on, and he commands respect. He was also a very intimidating figure for his time. I believe Washington was like 6'2" or 6'3", and just, you know, broad shoulders, so very intimidating. But when he was always trying to act humble, like, George Washington, you're the best. We want you to be president. Oh, shucks. Me? Really? Oh, come on. But deep down, he wanted it, right? But he never wanted to show it. So yeah, it's funny, but that's why they have him in that uniform. It's not just a drawing.
On an amazing solution. They would simply ask the British to stop. Can you stop? No. It didn't work. Okay, then tell the local militias to start arming and be ready at a minute's notice. And across the colonies, these Minutemen stood ready for the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Now, having your colonies in open rebellion is one thing. Once they start arming themselves, that's when it really hits the fan.
Yep.
So British General Thomas Gage ordered 700 troops from Boston out into the rebel-controlled Massachusetts countryside to destroy stores of arms and ammunition held by the rebels in Concord. The British set out in the middle of the night. Patriots including Paul Revere rode ahead to warn that the British were coming, giving the rebels...
Yeah, so the whole Paul Revere thing, I'm sure most of you already know. Paul Revere, number one, his ride was really not that important in the big picture and the big scheme of things, because number one, he was not the only one out there who was riding. Number two, his ride was actually very short in comparison, especially to the other men who were out riding that night. And number two, he never yelled the British are coming because, again, there is no declaration yet. There is no such thing yet as thinking of yourself as an American. Everybody is still British, right? It'd be like me going out here in New York City and, being like, the Americans are coming. The Americans are coming. And people will be like, the hell are you talking about? We are the Americans, right? So most likely, it's debated. He probably could have said like the redcoats are coming, or whatever it may be, but he didn't yell the British are coming. And again, the whole Paul Revere thing is really blown out of proportion. But yeah, that was General Gage is going to become a very important figure, because this is going to turn into a cluster F. But also once the war starts, General Gage, as well as General Howe, are going to make some very major tactical blunders.
It's time to prepare. The two sides met in Lexington as the sun began to rise. They faced off against each other, and in the confusion, somebody shot first. The shot heard around the world marked the beginning of the American War of Independence.
Wait 1 second.
As the sun began to rise, they faced off against each other, and in the confusion, somebody shot first.
Yeah, oversimplified, I'm going to have to call you out. So as you can see on the map here, they're talking about the battle at Lexington, right? So on that day, there were actually several different battles. But the Battle of Lexington and Concord are the two big battles that take place on this day. But the shot heard around the world that they're talking about actually takes place in Concord, not Lexington. So Lexington is the first battle, but Concord is where the shot takes place later on that day. And there was also fighting in several other places. I forget, it slips my mind, but yeah. The shot heard around the world was at Concord, not Lexington.
The sun began to rise. They faced off against each other, and in the confusion, somebody shot first. The shot heard around the world marked the beginning of the American War of Independence. The rebels were outnumbered and had to fall back to Concord as the British split up to search for rebel supplies. However, more and more Patriot rebels kept showing up, and this time it was the British who were outnumbered as more fighting kicked off in Concord. The most professional army in the world was forced to
the fighting really kicked off in Concord.
Flee back to Boston at the hands of local, poorly trained militiamen, and all along the British route back to Boston, Patriot rebels continued to gather and open fire on the retreating British. When the British reached Boston, the rebel militias surrounded them. Boston and the British were now under siege as small land and naval skirmishes continued around the city. And the British would suffer another embarrassing blow, this time in upstate New York. Colonel Benedict Arnold concocted a plan to take the British stronghold Fort Ticonderoga, which held a large amount of guns and ammunition. He set off towards the fort alone, hoping to recruit men along the way, when he came across the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, who, as it turned out, had the exact same plan he did. So they decided to work together. But I'm in charge. No, 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 I'm in charge. This went on for
this is literally what happened.
some time, until the Green Mountain Boys threatened to go home and Arnold had to concede. The group raided the fort at night while the Redcoats were asleep, and they caught them completely by surprise, taking the fort and all of its munitions with almost no resistance. Wow, great job, Ethan. Very impressive. By the way, what happened to that other guy we sent to take the fort? Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him.
Yeah, so I guess Remember that for later.
Ouch.
Oh, poor Benedict Arnold. But Benedict Arnold was not as inept as they're kind of trying to make him out. He was one of Washington's most trusted and fiercest generals, actually. Benedict Arnold was kind of a badass, really.
What the fuck? Nobody knew what was going on. The colonies were in open rebellion, and for now, they even seemed to be winning. So King George fired General Gage, replaced him with General William Howe, and ordered the rebellion to be put down immediately. Okay, the British are definitely going to retaliate for all of this, so we should probably put together a proper army. First, we need to pick a commander-in-chief, and I think we can all agree that that job should go to the man, the myth, the legend, George Washington. My friends, I am humbled and honored that you would consider me for such an important role. I did not expect for this. All right, you've been showing up in a military uniform every day for the last 10 months. We all know you wanted this, so cut the crap, George.
Yeah, John Adams, this is one of the reasons John Adams was not liked by a lot of his brethren. He was very blunt. He was very direct. He's definitely not somebody who was socially, he was very socially awkward. So in his bluntness, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had ADHD or something like that. Yeah, pretty much. I don't know if this actually happened, but I would not be surprised if Adams actually called out Washington like that.
Dude. Uncool. So Washington began his journey up to Boston to take command of the newly established Continental Army, just as the British made their first major attempt to break the siege. They made plans to take the high ground on Bunker Hill, but spies warned the Continentals of the British plans, so they fortified Bunker Hill and set up defensive positions on nearby Breed's Hill. The day of the battle came, and as the British advanced, a barrage of Continental gunfire was opened up on them. Twice they tried to climb the hill, twice they were pushed back. The battle lasted 3 hours until the Continentals finally ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, allowing the British to take the hill. While technically a British victory, they suffered nearly 1,000 casualties to the Continentals' 400.
Really, that was one of the big issues. Number one, the Continental Army really wasn't an army, right? It was made up of, again, local people like the Minutemen. And then eventually later on, once the war actually breaks out, mercenaries are hired, like Hessians, for example. But then the Americans can't pay them. Desertion was a huge deal that Washington had to deal with. But just like in this battle, also the lack of munitions, right? Most of the weapons that they had were just weapons that these men had bought from home. It wasn't like, there was a government yet, or that the Continental Congress was able to supply them with weapons. So the majority of the weapons were just whatever people had lying around the house. So really, yes, it was a British victory, but only because the colonists had run out of ammunition. But as you can see, the British suffer the heavier losses here.
The colonists showed the British that this wasn't just a rebellion, it was war, and they were ready for it. But one thing they weren't sure about was why they were fighting. While some radicals were starting to throw around the I word, most hoped to eventually repair their relationship with Great Britain. So they sent a letter to King George saying, "Hey man, looks like things aren't going your way. Remove the taxes and let's be friends? I'm gonna kick your ass." Send that to the colonies. Your Majesty, your handwriting is terrible. Are you sure?
Your handwriting is terrible. George III. So George III is very young when he becomes king. He is also a part of a very recent dynasty that had just started in England. I forget the name. It slips my mind. But he was either the second or the third king. And he was the first in his line that was actually of English descent. The previous king, I believe, didn't even speak English, if I'm not mistaken. I believe he was German. But also, there's been a lot written on the subject of King George III and his mental faculties. Or if you've ever seen the movie The Madness of King George. And there's a lot of debate on when it started, but it would explain a lot of the poor decisions that he made when it came to the colonies, right?
Just do it. What does it say? He's gonna lick my...
I love the way the two of them look at the kid like, it's gonna lick our what?
Gross. So for the remainder of the year, small engagements continued to occur.
John Adams was like, gross, but Benjamin Franklin would have been like, really? Tell me more.
Around the colonies. The British burned down the towns of Falmouth, Massachusetts and Norfolk, Virginia as revenge for earlier anti-British incidents. These actions played right into the hands of patriot propaganda. Overseas, the British were seen as brutes, and the French and Spanish would soon begin sending supplies to the rebel cause. During this time, there was also minor fighting going on between patriot and loyalist militias in the southern colonies. Benedict Arnold was still on a mission to win some personal glory for himself, so he headed up an attempt to invade Canada in a two-pronged attack.
Yeah, this was by far one of the dumbest, again, Benedict Arnold's certified badass, right? But definitely somebody who was a clout chaser, definitely somebody who wanted recognition, and partially is why he does what he does eventually when he betrays the Americans. But this, like it was so out of left field. Like, we're over here like, all right, so we're fighting for our independence. We got to get this army together because all we got is this ragtag group of, homeboys, who are coming in with like basically whatever gats they got at home. Then like we got to figure out how we going to unite everybody. The fuck is he doing over there? He's trying to invade Canada. Canada? The fuck you trying to invade Canada for? Jesus Christ, what's wrong with you?
Continentals managed to capture some British forts and the city of Montreal, but a harsh snowstorm with some smallpox on the side saw them defeated and pushed back at Quebec City, and they were forced to retreat all the way to Fort Ticonderoga. Speaking of which, remember all those guns and ammunition? Well, this guy's got a plan for what to do with them. He uses oxen to drag 120,000 pounds of artillery for 2 months through the harsh winter, 300 miles all the way to Washington and his Continental army surrounding Boston.
See, why don't you think of that one, Benedict Arnold, instead of trying to invade Canada? The hell's wrong with you trying to invade Canada, man? The fight's over here. Where you going?
And boom, Washington's got himself some big guns, which is fortunate because up until now his army had been suffering through the cold winter, not knowing when the siege would end. Now they...
And like I said, desertion was a huge problem because of the fact that, again, a lot of these soldiers, if you could really call them soldiers, because most of these men are not well trained at all. Most of these men, again, really kind of don't want to be there or are unsure, but especially when you're spending all this time, especially through such a brutal winter, and kind of don't know what you're fighting for, and you're not armed well, you could imagine that a lot of people desert, but desertion is going to be a huge issue throughout the entire war.
He could make a move. Washington wanted to launch a full assault on the city, but his junior officers felt the British were too fortified, and to his credit, Washington was great at hearing and taking on board the idea.
Yes. This is one of, I think, if not one of the most important characteristic that Washington possessed that made him the right man, right place for the right jobs, right? Is that Washington, while, yes, he wanted the fame and he wanted to be a leader, at the end of the day, he was also very cognizant of the precedents, his mark on history, every decision that he made, that it was going to shape future decisions. And also that he didn't know everything and he couldn't know everything. So he was also great at character and surrounding himself with people that were experts in different fields that he was not familiar with, and deferring to their decision making, but at the same time letting everyone know that he's the final word, right? But unlike other leaders who think they know everything and Washington always knew his limits and always surrounded him with men who were better thinkers than himself in some cases, or at least better thinkers in fields that he was unfamiliar with, especially people like Hamilton and Adams, right?
Ideas of others. Instead, the Continentals worked through the night, setting the guns up on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city. And when dawn broke and the British saw the guns, they knew they were toast. Their positions were completely exposed. It was checkmate. They had no choice but to abandon the city. 120 ships carried 9,000 redcoats and 2,000 loyalists away to an unknown fate. And Washington had his first victory of the war. Washington then moved his army to New York, knowing that when the British returned, they would probably land there. In the meantime, a friendly-looking old man by the name of Thomas Paine had written and published a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he advocated for total independence from...
And again, if I know... God damn it, man, I'm doing a show. Get the hell back in your room. Thank you. Jesus. If you haven't read Common Sense, I highly suggest, because I know most people have just heard of it and kind of know what it's about. But if you've not read Thomas Paine's Common Sense, because it still holds true to this day. And a lot of what he writes about is applicable to current events as well, not just history.
Great Britain. It spread across the colonies like wildfire, and to this day remains the best-selling title in America. It was read aloud in taverns and meeting halls, and brought the idea of independence into the mainstream. Congress began to seriously consider the idea. Thomas Jefferson was selected to write up an official Declaration of Independence, and he went hard, writing that all men are created equal, with certain inalienable...
Yeah, so again, I correct this... Get back in there. I correct this every time this comes up. Thomas Jefferson is selected, just like Washington was selected to lead the army. Jefferson was selected to lead the writing of the Declaration of Independence, but he did not do it alone. So John Adams and Benjamin Franklin were also selected, but Jefferson was kind of like, you know, the head writer, so to speak. But, I mean, Adams and Franklin's influence is absolutely undeniable in the Declaration of Independence.
Inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
And also life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration also is heavily influenced, and he kind of cribbed notes off John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers, but specifically life, liberty, and property, which they changed to the pursuit of happiness, because you want people to think they can own property? The hell is wrong with you? We can own property. Let them pursue happiness. What does that mean? I don't know. Just sounds good. Does sound good, right?
Yes. Of course, Jefferson had over 100 slaves, but we don't have to talk about that. On the 2nd of July, Congress voted unanimously in favor of independence, and John Adams declared that the 2nd of July would go down as the most remembered day in American history. Then a couple days later,
yeah, unfortunately it didn't.
Independence actually came into effect. The United States of America was born.
Yeah, so to kind of quickly clear up the confusion around this, so a lot of people are like, oh, well, technically July 2nd is when we should be celebrating Independence Day. Other people say it should be August. And then others, of course, agreed, no, it should remain July 4th, right? So July 2nd is when they presented the draft, but it was signed by a few of the delegates on the 4th of July. So that's when it actually took effect, right? Just like any law or proclamation, until it's actually signed, it doesn't have any effect whatsoever. Or any contract, right? It's the signature date that is important, not when it was written. So July 2nd is out of here, okay? Now, the reason some people say August is, it's not like that famous painting that you see of all the delegates and Washington standing there and everybody signing. No, it was signed kind of, like piecemeal, like, hey, when can you come in? I can sign it on Thursday. All right, when are you coming in? 2 weeks from now. So that's why it took all the way until August, because, again, number one, You didn't have e-signatures or fax machines or email, and it took a long ass time to get like from place to place because you were traveling by horse and buggy, right? So that's why a lot of people say, well, it wasn't signed by everybody until August. No, but it was signed by the initial people on the 4th of July. So that's why it should be the 4th of July.
There was no turning back now. The Americans tore down a statue of King George in New York and melted him down into 42,000 musket balls.
Yes, now we're getting into the stuff that really excites me, because this is all close to home for me. You know, growing up in New York City, this is a huge deal. So you can actually still visit the place where this took place. So unlike, for example, the Civil War, with the Civil War, you know, why the Civil War gets more attention than the Revolutionary War is the Revolutionary War not only seems so distant for a lot of people, but there's really nothing you can touch, right? Whereas with the Civil War, there are so many things you could still see, that you could still visit, that you could still touch, that is still preserved to this day as it was in the 1860s. So there's a more closer connection, not just time-wise, but also with the actual physical ability, right? Whereas with the Revolutionary War, it's so much more distant and such a completely different time. And also, there are very few physical things that you could still see. Now, the statue was located in the Bowling Green section of New York City, right? And it was torn down by the Sons of Freedom, not to be confused with the Sons of Liberty. And so this is in the financial district. So basically in the historic section of Wall Street at Bowling Green is the Alexander Hamilton Customs Building, which I've been to a lot of times. And right in front of the building, there's still a metal fence, a circular fence. Well, not really a fence. It's kind of like maybe like 3-4 feet tall, but an enclosure, so to speak. And in the middle of that was where that statue of King George was torn down. So you can actually still see the site, and the surrounding enclosure is the same enclosure that was there. The only thing that's kind of missing is they cut off also the tips of each of the metal bars. I believe had little crowns on them, and I think they cut those off as well.
To the British, it was treason, and if the king had his way, Washington and all of Congress would be hung. Speaking of the British, guess who's back? The king sent an intimidating force of 130 warships and 25,000 men to New York. Washington knew that taking on the most powerful military in the world wouldn't be easy. The British set up camp on Staten Island as the Americans dug into defensive positions around Brooklyn Heights.
Okay, so this is, again, because this is such a big deal, because Brooklyn, right, from Brooklyn. So this is known as the Battle of Long Island by some, but of course, if you're from Brooklyn, it's called the Battle of Brooklyn because it takes place in what is modern day Brooklyn. At the time, there was no Brooklyn, right? It was just Long Island. So whether you call it the Battle of Long Island or the Battle of Brooklyn, you're not wrong. But if you're in Brooklyn and you say it's the Battle of Long Island, we're going to have a war, right? So this takes place, and this is the first, this is the opening battle of the war, right? Because it's the first battle that takes place after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So I'm trying to remember, I pulled up my notes here because I knew it would come up, and if it didn't come up, I would make sure to bring it up. So this takes place on August in 1776. At the western edge of Long Island in present-day Brooklyn, New York, right? So the British land in Staten Island, as they mention, and then they come up through the old neighborhood I used to live in and eventually make their way through the Gravesend section of Brooklyn, which is basically close to Sheepshead Bay, so not that far from the ocean. And then they basically make Washington have to start retreating up to Brooklyn Heights. So that's why it's also known as the Battle of Brooklyn Heights sometimes. And actually, again, talking about physical touch, in Park Slope, which is the northern end of Brooklyn, which is very close to Manhattan, there's still a house there. It's called the Old Stone House. And that house is still, it was moved and some of it was repaired, but the house is still intact and you can visit it to this day. It's a museum from the Revolutionary War, from this battle. And inside they have musket balls from the battle. They have uniforms. It's really an amazing place. So if you're ever in Brooklyn and you want to visit something historic, look up the Old Stone House.
Waiting for an attack to come, but the British just waited, wearing down their opponent's nerve while building their own strength.
And then came up
they
from
launched
behind.
a big scary artillery barrage and then said, you know, if I was you right now, I'd probably sue for peace. But Washington told them to shove it. The Americans kept holding out for what was coming, and when they finally hit, they hit hard. 15,000 British troops approached the American position, and the two sides fired on each other in massive rows. But what the Americans didn't realize was they were only fighting a decoy. The main British force was going around to flank the Americans from behind, and when they arrived, they inflicted heavy casualties. The Americans panicked and retreated back to Brooklyn Heights, where they then found themselves trapped between the British army and the river. It looked as though the war was already lost, but luckily, instead of attacking, the British decided to dig in for it.
Yes. So this is why I said both Gage and Howe make absolute, I mean, this one is probably the biggest blunder. Because Howe at this point feels like, bro, this is kind of embarrassing, really? Like y'all thought you were going to win this? Like, we just whooped your ass. And Howe could have ended it that day. That day, the revolution could have ended before it even took off, right? But Howe, again, somewhat disputed, but the majority of historians agree that Howe just kind of had like a soft spot, right? And was like, you know what, let's let them regroup. You know, obviously we're going to whip their ass tomorrow. So let's just relax, everybody. Take 5, smoke them if you got them, right? And this was a huge tactical mistake because Washington ends up escaping and getting all of his troops out across the river into Manhattan without losing a single life, without losing a single weapon. He just sneaks off in the night, and huge mistake.
For a siege, and then a thick fog set in, allowing Washington's army to escape across the river unimpeded. The British continued to chase and engage the Americans at Manhattan, and the Americans suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. It was a disaster. Washington's leadership was called into question, as thousands of American POWs were left to rot as traitors. Washington's army fled through New Jersey all the way down to Pennsylvania.
Oh man, this is really important.
It was a disaster. Washington's leadership was called into question, as thousands of American POWs were left to rot as traitors.
Yes, this is something that really is very rarely, if ever, covered. And that is the treatment of POWs during the Revolutionary War. And I was kind of hoping they would bring this up because I want to shout out probably my favorite professor that I ever had, Edwin Burroughs. He unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. This man was, when we talk about teachers having an influence, probably one of 2 professors that just completely changed my life. And it was just an honor to have him as one of my professors, especially when I was doing my postgraduate work. So Edwin Burroughs was a distinguished professor at Brooklyn College, and he and Mike Wallace wrote a book called Gotham, which was a complete history of New York up to 1898, which is when Brooklyn became part of New York City, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for that. And then he spent 20 years writing that book, by the way, and it's a voluminous book. But then he wrote a book called Forgotten Patriots, which is the untold story of American prisoners during the Revolutionary War. And he won the Francis Tavern Museum Book Award for that back in 2008. And actually, I was there when he did a reading from his book at the Old Stone House, which I just mentioned. I highly recommend this book. Again, it's called Forgotten Patriot by Edwin G. Burroughs. And this book really goes into amazing detail about the treatment, which was horrific. I mean, I had no clue until I read his book, and then he told me all about it. So I know they gloss over this, but this was just an extremely horrific part of this war, more horrible than any of the battles that actually took place during the war.
Raiders. Washington's army fled through New Jersey all the way down to Pennsylvania. Rarely had an army been so badly beaten, yet survived to fight another day.
Yeah, all right. So that was excellent, man. I really, really thoroughly enjoyed that. Come on, OBS. Stop messing. So I really enjoyed that. Of course, part 2 is going to be coming soon. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm always kind of teetering on not wanting to make these videos too long, but there's so much I love talking about this. Like I said, this is my passion, right? I love history, and I love explaining all these little things. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I can't wait to do part 2. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything that I missed or anything you'd like me to maybe expound upon in the next video. But either case, I've been Teacher Eddie. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for the support, and I'll catch you next time. And as always, shouting out the Patreons who keep things running here. The Chancellors, Elena G, Alex S, Cuckles, John Alonzo, Naval Colt, The Hollow King, The Principal Tier, Addison Lynn, Blue Tech, Chad A, Chris H, Chrissy, Clement, Freeman Stephenson, Joshua Stewart, Kiara, Laura, Lord Gandalf, Muri Kakari, Nathan, Quiet J, Rachel H, Robin B, and Vijandra. I've been Teacher Eddie, and I'll catch you next time. Fam!